It's almost impossible to look at these photos without feeling a slight chill. Something about them just isn't quite right. The more you analyze them, the more uncomfortable you feel. The blueprints don't make sense, and neither does the number of photos. What are we looking at? What is out of focus? What's behind it? What is hiding in the shadows? Why would someone take photos like this? Simple mistake or intentional laser? Plain and simple. What are these snapshots hiding? The questions are growing. Even more so when you find out that these photos are the last evidence left by two women who, months later, would be found in the worst possible way. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. More than a decade ago, two young Dutch tourists disappeared in the green heart of Panama. What started as a walk along a popular trail ended up becoming one of the most disturbing mysteries in Latin America. Over time, the jungle offered various clues: an intact backpack, clothing, and even bones. But the answers never truly came to light. What happened between the last moment they were seen and the day their belongings appeared? What is known about their final hours based on information given to forensic experts? Who were the people who spoke with the girls before the tragic end? What does the official verdict say? Why? Many point to a dark scheme orchestrated by powerful people. Who are the main suspects, for those who don't believe it was an accident? What other deaths that happened later in the area support the idea that there are people who know much more than they say? Once again, we are facing a case that seems to remain unresolved, occasionally demanding the world's attention. The victims' relatives continue to appear in the media to emphasize that they are sure the truth is still far from coming out. To understand the details of the whole matter, we will need to delve into the darkest aspects of the case of the Dutch women who disappeared in Panama. In the quiet town of Amersfoort, located in the province of Utrecht, in the Netherlands, two friends shared dreams and a simple routine that would prepare them for what they described as their great adventure. In 2014, 21-year-old Kris was a radiant young woman. Those who knew her had no hesitation in describing her as creative, outgoing, and deeply responsible. She had just finished her studies in sociocultural education, specializing in art, and she was eager to find out what the next step in her professional life would be. Her roommate, Lisanne, 22, shared similar concerns. Lisanne had a degree in applied psychology from Deventer. She was optimistic, intelligent, and passionate about volleyball, a sport she played throughout her university years. The medals she had earned in that sport had given her a reputation as a persevering girl, and her colleagues predicted a bright future for her. In addition to being very professional and self-demanding, the young woman had instinct and knew how to follow her hunches. That's why she had suggested living together to Kris, and she hadn't been wrong. Both of them made a good team and knew how to support each other in the challenges they faced every day. Having each other made facing this new independent life they had started after finishing high school much more pleasant and enjoyable. The girls had met because both of them had gotten a job at a cafe restaurant called In der Kleinen Hub. There, between conversations and laughter during their breaks, they began to forge a friendship. Not only did they have a similar sense of humor and shared interests, but after just a few conversations, they realized they also had the same hopes for the future. In other words, meeting each other had made them feel much less lonely, not alone. Meeting all their midterms on time while supporting themselves financially had been rewarding but also exhausting. Before moving on to the next level, the girls agreed that they owed themselves an activity that would help them clear their minds. That's how they began planning. They would travel for fun, but also to deepen their commitments to their respective careers and their adult lives. They wanted to learn languages, help children in need, and get closer to other cultures to soak up new knowledge. They knew books were essential, but not enough. They wanted first-hand experiences that would give them broader perspectives and a less academic view of their surroundings. They wanted to make their own path and leave a meaningful mark in the process. With that in mind, they spread a map out in front of them and made a decision. they would go to Panama. The destination wasn't random. They knew the route there because their families were no strangers to tourism and adventure. So what could go wrong? They toasted to that decision, happy about the opportunities they imagined. However, things didn't go as they planned. That year they thought of as their sabbatical would bring with it a bloody and abrupt end. The friends started by doing the math. They knew they had to save for 6 months to be able to cover the expenses of the journey they had in mind. Many young people who plan trips see everything fall apart at this stage of the process. Sometimes it's hard to be consistent, especially when you have an irregular job and you're a teenager overwhelmed by countless stimuli from the outside world. However, Kris and Lisa stayed focused and never doubted or faltered. For half a year, they kept to themselves, cut down on many expenses, and put all their resources and mental energy into what was coming. They also organized toy and clothing drives. They would visit schools with children in vulnerable situations and wanted to make sure they didn't arrive empty-handed. Their plan, far from fading away over the months, became stronger and more complex. Kris and Lisa were ambitious and would spend endless nights taking notes on everything. The places they would visit, where they would stay, and how they would get from one place to another. They studied typical dishes and postcards. Their families showed an unusual concern about the fact that the girls would be away for so long in such a distant place. But they also knew they had to assume these were two young women attentive to the rules and responsible. Neither of them had ever had serious problems with authority, and they had never caused their parents any major headaches. Everything indicated that they should relax and trust that things would turn out well. Only they wouldn't. Things would not turn out well. Not well at all. On March 15, 2014, Kris and Lisa took off for Central America. After 2 weeks of travel and sightseeing, they arrived in Boquete, a charming town among coffee plantations and clouds, and settled with a local family on March 29. Slowly but surely, they were making their dreams come true. It's true that things had some setbacks. Their schedules had to be changed due to a logistical error with one of the places that was supposed to host them in the first place. These setbacks confused them and discouraged them a little, just as they would record in their diaries and when communicating with their loved ones. However, they quickly drew their first lesson from the trip. Sometimes things don't entirely depend on you, and the most important thing is to know how to adapt. So, what did they do then? Kris and Lisa took advantage of those days to enjoy themselves in Boquete. Every day was a mix of learning, laughter, and small linguistic challenges. No one imagined that these cheerful young women with big professional aspirations would soon become the protagonists of a story worthy of a horror movie. Tuesday, April 1, 2014. The morning dawned clear in Boquete with that fresh air that slips between the mountains before the fog begins to rise. Kris and Lisanne ate breakfast together. Some say they did so in the company of 2 young Dutchmen with whom they had shared a few outings. Others say that it's true they weren't alone, but that they weren't with other tourists, but rather with some locals. We'll go into these possibilities later on. At a certain point in the morning, the friends headed toward a trail that promised them a beautiful views and the chance to walk and chat in a relaxed way. It was said that the dog from a local restaurant, a friendly mixed breed named Blue, joined them at the start of the walk. From here, contradictions abound in the case. Both family members, officials, and witnesses began to give changing testimonies over the years. A first controversial factor was the taxi that took them to the exact spot where the hike would begin. The driver of that taxi would mention times that did not match other evidence that would indicate the girl's actual location. Simple calculation errors, or was the information being manipulated from the start? The friends were not looking for a risky or extensive expedition, at least not apparently. The idea was to walk the El Pianista Trail, a path popular among visitors because it offers the chance to look out over the Continental Divide, a watershed line that separates the Atlantic and Pacific basins. The usual route, which takes a few hours, starts at a point near the main road and climbs up to a natural viewpoint, then returns along the same path. It's a moderately difficult trail, and nothing made Lisa and Kris think that things could get complicated. By mid-morning, the girls were last seen near the beginning of the trail. The first part of the path is wide and clear, lined with lush plants and coffee orchards. Further up, the path narrows. The ground is covered with mud and roots, and the singing of birds mixes with the distant murmur of streams. It's important to note that daylight hours in Boquete are short. At 6:30 post-meridian darkness already settles in the jungle with an almost physical weight, and the sounds change. Crickets and frogs replace the birds, and the humidity turns cold on your skin. That's why it was a bit disconcerting that by 7 post-meridian Lisa and Kris hadn't shown up. They hadn't contacted anyone. They say the dog returned alone. Even though that wasn't typical, no one in the village raised any immediate alarms. The host family didn't have strict schedules and thought the young women might have taken the opportunity to go on another adventure. After all, they were very sociable teenagers who always seemed eager to keep exploring. What if they had made friends with other people and had improvised another outing? And what if they had then gone to a bar? Why couldn't that be a possibility, at least that kind of socializing? These are the excuses that the host family would present to the authorities a few days later. For some, their inactivity in those first hours after Kris and Lisa disappeared is more than suspicious and deserves to be taken more seriously. In any case, real concern began to grow when the 2 Dutch women did not show up for an appointment they had the following morning. With a local guide named Feliciano, that guide would be the first to put the girls' names on the radar. He would later become another of the complex pieces of this puzzle. What matters to know now is that on April 2nd, life in Boquete went on as usual. Unaware that at some point between the mountain and the river, 2 young women were desperately searching for a way to return. Silence around them had already begun and would last for days, until it became a disturbing void. When the families of Kris and Lisanne received the news that their daughters had not returned, they wasted no time. There were calls to embassies and international protocols were activated. By April 3rd, concerns had arisen on both continents, and by April 6th, the alarm was official. The Panamanian police, canine units, and local volunteers began to search trails, streams, and neighboring communities. Posters with their faces appeared on stores, hostels, and light poles in Boquete. The search, intense in its first days, soon ran into the obstacles of the area's geography. The Cherokee jungle is not a place that can be easily explored. The paths branch off and get lost. The vegetation engulfs everything, and the terrain can shift from a trail to a steep ravine in just meters. The fog, the rain, and the heat form a triangle that worked against any prolonged tracking. As the weeks went by, the hope of an immediate discovery faded away. By mid-April, the official search decreased. However, relatives and Dutch specialists remained in Panama, coordinating with local guides, reviewing maps, and possible alternative routes that the young women might have taken. 2 months after June 14, 2014, an indigenous Ngebe woman who lived in the Alto Romero area went out to wash clothes. At the edge of the Colubre River, among rocks and branches, she saw something that didn't belong to the landscape, a blue backpack with black details. She picked it up and brought it to her community. From there, it was handed over to the police, and it was confirmed that it was the one Lisa and Kris had with them when they got into the taxi. From wrestling to the teaspoon. The backpack was the first real discovery after weeks of nothing, an intact object that seemed unwilling to reveal the full story. The families, upon seeing it, felt relief at having a piece of the missing girls, but they also experienced a new blow of uncertainty. How did it get there? Who had placed it so carefully by the river? Inside there was a frozen snapshot of the trip, 2 pairs of sunglasses, 2 bras, a bottle of water, $83 in cash, the passports, Kris's iPhone, Lisanne's Samsung Galaxy, and a Canon PowerShot digital camera. Everything was surprisingly dry and in good condition, as if it hadn't spent weeks exposed to the humidity of the jungle and the river. According to later records extracted from their phones, around 4:39 p.m. on the same day they had entered the Pianista, the first attempt to call for help was made. While Lisanne had dialed 911 from her Samsung, Kris had done the same from her iPhone, except she had dialed 112, the equivalent of the emergency number in their home country. Unfortunately, for both of them, there was no signal in that area. It's not known for sure where they spent that first night. What is known is that the attempts to make contact continued the next day, always without getting a signal. The last intermittent power-on suggests that at least one of the devices was used until April 11th, 10 days after the initial hike. It was also found that the emergency calls were made by someone who couldn't correctly enter the phone's unlock pattern. What did this mean? Only emergency numbers were called and none tried to contact family members, despite speaking daily. Why hadn't the cell phone user been able to unlock it? Nerves. That would explain one or two failed attempts, but the studies showed something else, right? So, did someone who wasn't the owner of the device try to use it? If that was the case, did it mean the girls weren't alone? Did it mean that maybe one of them was trying to use the other's cell phone? This data, later reconstructed by experts, is one of the few temporal certainties that allow us to imagine the moment when the hike came to an end. And it turned into a serious problem. The questions grew in both number and depth. After investigators downloaded the backpack camera's contents, they found over 100 photos, and several reasons for the mystery to escalate to another level. And that's how our story goes back to the beginning. The first photos from April first showed the girls smiling on the trail, posing at viewpoints and next to streams in broad daylight. But then, in the early hours of April 8th, a sequence of 90 images taken in complete darkness captured objects and surroundings barely illuminated by the flash. Branches, rocks, what seemed to be a part of Kris's head, a belt hanging over a rock, instant plastic bags that, rather than clarifying things, added mystery and a sense of murkiness to the matter. It was also discovered that one photo, the key photo, the one that should have been between the happy photos and the disturbing ones, had been deleted from a computer. But how could this be possible? Who had made that image disappear, and why? And beyond that, what did all those pictures taken in the dark mean? Had someone taken them who, lost in the forest, was trying to signal for help? Had they been taken to try to light the way? Were they taken by accident? More importantly, were the girls the ones who took them? Finding the backpack in June 2014 revived the investigation, but what followed brought even more uncertainty. The blue backpack prompted new searches, this time near the Colubre River shortly after the discovery of jeans owned by Kris. They were carefully folded and placed on a rock upstream. Who was playing with the investigators? How could it be that the clues appeared like that, planted out of nowhere? More and more desperate, the girls' families offered a reward of about $30,000 for any information that could lead to the whereabouts of the girls, an incentive that attracted locals and private searchers. That reward was also the center of some suspicions. As soon as it was announced, a local guide familiar with the currents and access points in the area found what would be considered the most gruesome clue. A blue Merrell brand sneaker. Inside, still protected by the fabric, there was a human foot. The boot seemed to belong to Lisanne Froome. Just a few weeks later, new clues began to appear in the same area of the river. Who was responsible for finding them? The already mentioned Feliciano. Yes, the same person who had raised the first alarm. Among wet stones and low vegetation, a fragment of pelvis appeared, along with more scattered bone remains. In total, 33 bone fragments would be recovered, most of them small and fragile. As if time and the environment had sought to dismantle the story. DNA analyses confirmed what everyone feared. They belonged to the missing Dutch women. But it was the condition of the remains that sparked new doubts. Remains the jungle. The bones associated with Lisanne seem to have gone through a natural decomposition process in the jungle. They retained some moisture and even traces of tissue. Kris's, on the other hand, were bleached, as if they had been exposed to the sun or some process that accelerated their deterioration. A Panamanian forensic expert suggested it might be differential decomposition due to environmental factors. But other specialists, including Dutch consultants, other Dutch specialists, it was striking and difficult to explain by nature alone. The bone surface showed no cuts, weapon marks, or clear signs of violence, not in anything that could be analyzed. There was also no way to know if the young women had died on the same day or if any of them had survived longer. The currents of the Colubre could carry objects and human remains for kilometers, but the arrangement of the evidence seemed more orderly. The chaos of the jungle can allow, in criminology, the place where a body is found, its parts, can be as revealing as the body itself. And in this case, the positions, the condition, and the timing of each discovery drew an incomplete map that each observer interpreted in their own way. The local detectives talked about scavenger animals, although they were unable to provide further arguments to support that. For the families, each recovered fragment was a heavy blow. It wasn't the reunion they had imagined when they traveled to Panama, it was more of a partial confirmation. The girls were no longer alive. But the story of how they met their end was still not fully written. While authorities stuck to the accident explanation, some in and outside Panama began suggesting there was more to the story. Details that didn't fit, sequences of improbable events, and a pattern of discoveries too strange to attribute solely to chance. With the backpack, photos, and bone remains recovered, the story already had a basic timeline. However, the official narrative and popular suspicions began to move in different directions. As we said, some investigators and part of the public opinion leaned from the very beginning toward the simplest hypothesis, an accident. The Panamanian jungle, beautiful and lush, could turn in a matter of minutes into a deadly trap for anyone unfamiliar with its paths and whims. It was said that both young women might have become disoriented during the hike, straying from the Pianista Trail into less traveled areas. The rugged geography, sudden changes in weather, rising rivers, and the inability to find clear landmarks could have left them isolated. Without food, without shelter, struggling against exhaustion and injuries. The emergency calls from the phone, unsuccessful, reinforced for some the idea that they were alive but trapped, and that simply no one arrived in time. But the accident hypothesis didn't convince everyone. That's how the theory of a third person emerged. A guide, a stranger, or someone who might have crossed paths with them and whose role in the outcome was still shrouded in mystery. Had the girls been ambushed and consequently murdered? In Boquete, as in any tourist spot, the constant flow was accompanied by rumors of thefts, assaults, and situations that didn't always make it to the press. However, there was never any solid evidence of sexual or deliberate physical violence against them, and the police insisted that there were no conclusive signs of an attack. Among the more technical hypotheses, certain experts considered an intermediate scenario, an initial accident that led to a slow chain of complications. One of them may have been injured while trying to cross a river or descend a slope, leaving the other with the task of seeking help. This would explain why, at certain times, only one of the phones was turned on or used. The long sequence of call attempts, interspersed with days of no activity, could have been due to the hope of finding a signal or simply periodic tests to see if they succeeded. With nothing else to do, the families of both publicly and heartbreakingly accepted the official report, although they never stopped pointing out that there were aspects that didn't quite add up. The truth is that the theories, far from being closed, are still alive. As long as the last hours of the Dutch tourists cannot be reconstructed with absolute certainty, the space for conjecture will remain as fertile as the jungle itself, where everything happened. And the theory that has gained the most ground online in recent years is the one that revolves around the already mentioned guide named Feliciano. The first image that many people evoke is that of a countryman, weathered by the tropical rain and the Honduran sun, with leather boots and a machete hanging over his shoulder. On the morning of April 2014, Kris and Lisanne reportedly had contact with him. The guide was a well-known figure in Boquete, especially for those who explored beyond the usual. It is believed that Feliciano had offered the girls a 2-day hike, including a stay at his cabin in the forest, something they declined, citing expenses and academic commitments in their Spanish classes. The next day, when the young women missed the scheduled tour, Feliciano visited the house where they volunteered. It was later learned that he opened the door, checked the room, and realized they hadn't spent the night there. As we mentioned, it was him who alerted the authorities and started the search. Soon after, as we saw, he became a key figure in the investigation. He pointed out areas to the detectives and took part in the discovery of bone fragments. That made him a central figure in the story, a guide who had lost contact with his clients and at the same time had helped to find them. That role generated controversy. For some, his cooperation seemed sincere. Feliciano's defenders emphasized his time and effective help when the case had gone cold. They pointed to him as the natural link between the authorities, the community, and the investigators. And they considered that his wisdom had been vital to recover evidence that otherwise would have remained hidden. Even in international media, the dilemma was expressed cautiously. Some residents of Boquete noted, after speaking with him and others, that the guide had not been seen on the trail the day of the disappearance, and that his actions were those of a professional who was trying to help in a critical situation. But for others, he was really suspicious. They even drew a disturbing parallel when comments from tourists appeared, indicating some inappropriate attention toward European women by the man. Some testimonies say Feliciano had anger fits and often joked. He would joke about cutting off the laziest tourist's legs with his machete. Details that, although lacking any evidence, fueled the rumors against him. Not to mention how timely his discoveries had been, all made after the families offered the substantial reward. In a 2022 interview, the man said the accusations resulted in threats and social media attacks, and even boycotts from hotels and occasional tour operators in Boquete, affecting his reputation and that of his family. The waters were sharply divided who was truthful. What many didn't realize was that the private investigators were actually watching both Feliciano and his son. In Boquete, where the trails intertwine like the veins of an ancient organism, stories circulate that are born in the light of day but are fed in the shadows. One of them revolves around Tito, the son of Feliciano, the guide who helped so much and at the same time attracted suspicion after the disappearance of Kris and Lisanne, according to the podcast publication Lost in Panama. Sources from the community say that days before that April 2014, the young women had contact with a group of young people from Boquete. That group included Tito and other well-known figures like Murgas, Sabroson, and El Cuervo. The version surrounding this rumor is clandestine in tone and fragmentary in details. It is said that Kris and Lisanne were at a local nightclub at some point, spent a night with those guys, and then headed to the trail. The theory suggests that members of that group may have asked the taxi driver about them before they went in. Pianist, this rumor lacks solid evidence. There are no public records, official complaints, or court statements confirming Tito's involvement in the events. No documents place him near the trail that day. The narrative mainly spreads in non-academic and non-journalistic spaces, driven by neighbor conversations or anonymous testimonies gathered by case-focused media. And the truth is that this is just the tip of the iceberg, because when people tried to investigate this angle, strange deaths began to occur. The man, whose taxi took Kris and Lisanne to the beginning of the trail from which they would never return, died months later under suspicious circumstances. They say he had tried to change his statements, as if he was willing to point to someone who until then had remained in the shadows. It was March 2005 when the driver was found lifeless in the waters of Los Canguilones Resort in Hualaca, The official report, according to Panamanian media, says he died after jumping into the river soon after eating. No completely satisfactory explanation was given for this death. Moreover, this was not the only dark echo that emerged. It is said that other people connected to the case also died under unclear circumstances. Osman Valenzuela, a young man who claimed to have seen the girls, disappeared 3 days later. His body was found drowned. Jose Manuel Murgas, associated with Osman, died in a mysterious crash a year later. For his part, Jorge Rivera Miranda was also found drowned in shallow waters. A few months later, he had started to be pointed out as someone willing to tell a secret version of the matter. These coincidences, in an area where tension was already in the air, impacted the local community and relatives in the Netherlands. And although there is no evidence of a direct connection between these deaths and what happened to Kris Lisanne, the official account never addressed them clearly. Is it just a coincidence? If not, what does this pattern of deaths reveal? Could it be the way someone found to warn the locals about the dangers of stepping out of line? When this information threatened to get out, the media presented a theory just as unfounded, but one that people felt more empathy for. There were rumors of cannibalism, that the girls had been kidnapped and abused by a tribe that had shown them no mercy. The prejudice against those indigenous peoples fueled the fire of this accusation. And for months, this headline, appealing because of its sensationalism, overshadowed the string of mysterious deaths. The Bouquet jungle, with its dense foliage and trails, has kept many secrets. Among them, the secret of 2 young women who arrived hopeful, only to have their fate end in tragedy and uncertainty. More than a decade after that, April of 2014, the official versions, alternative theories, and uncomfortable silences continue to intertwine in a tangle that no one has been able to fully unravel. In the area, some locals still remember the story as if it were a warning. They say the jungle doesn't forget, that it swallows what it wants and only gives back what suits it. Others, more skeptical, point out that the case was mishandled from the beginning and that the evidence that could have clarified the truth was lost in a sea of mistakes and omissions, or negligence and complicity. If it's true that Feliciano was involved, why did they cover for him? Why did he have so much power? His figure? Was he the coordinator of some kind of mafia whose tentacles reached the highest spheres of power in Panama? A detail that is far from minor is that, along with the remains of the tourists, bones that did not belong to them were also found. In fact, it is still unknown to whom they belonged. What is happening at those coordinates? Is Boquete perhaps a key point for human trafficking? Is it a free zone, a place where criminals can carry out vile acts? Rituals, could it be? Does the image of Kris and Lisanne still live on in the photographs that circulated around the world? 2 smiling young women, full of life, unaware that a tourist trail would become a maze with no way out. At the same time, the jungle, silent and humid, is still there, welcoming new hikers, who may not know that beneath its roots and among its shadows, the trace of a mystery remains, one that neither time nor science has been able to fully solve. A trace that reminds us nature is untamable, and that humans can have a much darker side than our imagination allows us to conceive. A trace that is irrefutable proof that some paths have no return. Today, these photos still cause insomnia among those who see them. Will he ever try to find the missing detail, the clue that was lost for years? Will we ever know what was happening in all those corners that weren't captured by the camera? Above all, and even more unsettling, what did Lisa and Kris see before they died?